Welcome back to Lend Me Your Ear. This is Chapter 3, First Discoverers of America, Christopher Colonus, his expedition. Christopher Colonus, aka Christopher Columbus. As to their coming thither of themselves, it may easily be confuted. Who knows not that there is no country a continued pasture, but luxurious vales separated with inaccessible mountains, lakes, and vast wildernesses? But David Ingram relates that he saw some horses in the northern America, which the Mexicans and other conquests of the Spaniards never heard of. Whereupon we may conclude, and we suppose without all peradventure, that the Americans have absolutely their original from Tartary, which bordering Armenia, where Noah's Ark first rested, has a convenient way, though beyond the Arctic Circle through a temperate climate between heat and cold, to Cathay in the same parallel with the neighboring America. Christopher Colonus, generally, though by mistake, called Columbus, was born in Arbizolo, a village in the dominion of Genoa near Savona. His father lived by fishing in the Midland Sea, so that Sebastian Schroeter and others besides him are mistaken, saying Colonus was born in the city Cucur, and descended from the noble family Pilistrelli. Peter Bezerus, Colonus's countryman, gives unquestionable proofs of his mean extract, and amongst other things that the Commonwealth of Genoa refused to receive the great legacy which Colonus left them in his will, because they fondly thought it a derogation to their honour, being so great a republic, to take anything of bequest from a fisherman's son. Yet his Majesty of Castile thought otherwise, not only enriching him with wealth and a fair revenue for his discovery of the West Indies, but also, though of a low derivation, raised him to great honour, ennobling him the first of his family with dignities, titles, and escutcheon, which ranked him in place among his prime nobility. Colonus, whom we shall henceforth call Columbus, spent his youth near the sea, where he was busy exploring the winds, considering their natures and quarters whence they rose, especially with the setting of the current from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. The westerly winds, which often as well as the easterly blow several days together from the great ocean, much amusing him, hinted at last some notions that there might be another world and new places to be discovered beyond the setting of the sun, and that the Ne Plus Ultra should not be, if he could help it, the commanding terminary of the earth that way. He also spent much time, being of a solid judgment in the emendations of charts and maps, then very much improvable, and the Portuguese, who at that time had got the start in navigation from all other people, being busy to find a way by the south of Africa to the East Indies, not content to go by hearsay, he went himself in person on a voyage with them. Soon after, Columbus settled himself on the island of Madeira, where an accident happened, which Francis Lopez de Gomesa relates thus: the master of a ship, whose name and country lie buried in oblivion, though some would have him to be of Spain, some an Andalusian or Biscayner, and others a Portuguese, trading to the Canaries and Flemish Isles, was surprised by a hideous tempest from the east, which hurried him nolens, volans through dreadful waves, where at last he found himself engaged upon a western coast altogether unknown. The storm ceasing, without making further discoveries, he picked his way homeward, at last landing in the haven of Madeira, all his crew but 3 and himself, with hardship, want, and the long voyage having perished, himself dangerously sick, was carried into Columbus's house, where lying on his deathbed, he bequeathed to Columbus's maps, journals, and other observations of his unfortunate voyage. Columbus, being by these papers more confirmed than ever in his opinion of a new world in the West, declared what he verily believed to the states of Genoa. But they looked upon him as a vain and idle fellow. Yet Columbus, full of his great project, thus slighted and scornfully rejected, sat not so down, but addressed himself to the King of Portugal, where they wearied him, spending long time with dilatory answers to no effect, the opinion of a whole court of expert navigators having cast his declaration out as a chimera or mere fancy. Soon after Columbus sending his brother into England to move the business to King Henry VII, he being taken prisoner by the way and lying long before his release, came too late to the English court, prevented by the news of Christophe's return with success from his intended voyage. Meanwhile Ferdinando and Isabella, King of Castile, having finished his wars with the Moors, had furnished him out for the expedition, which he effected by the favour of Alfonso Mendotio and Alfonso Quintavilla, both great ministers of state under Ferdinand and Isabella, and obtained so much at last that he was sent with 120 soldiers, besides seamen, in 2 ships and 1 pinnace. Thus supplied, he set sail from Cadiz, upon the king's account the 4th of August in the year 1492, and first reached the Canary Islands, and from thence steering southwest, the wind in 33 days, scarce varying 1 point. But though the weather blew so constant, yet the seamen changed their minds and stormed quite contrary, crying that Columbus was guilty of all their deaths. Said they, after they had lost sight of the Canaries so many days, nothing appearing but sea and sky, who can hope for any success or happy conclusion of such a desperate voyage, so rashly undertaken and found now so full of imminent danger? Yet Columbus bore bravely up and weathered all their exclamations, although they threatened no less than his murder. At last, articling, they came to this agreement, that if after sailing forwards 3 days more, no land was discovered, they should return. But about 2 o'clock the next night, Columbus saw a glimmering like fire in the sky, and in the morning found himself close aboard a most pleasant coast, where landing with 12 men, he erected a cross-cut out of a tree. Then he sailed over to Cuba, where the sea was so rough that he was forced to stand off, fearing rocks and shallow water. Soon after he got to the northward of the island Hayti, which he called Hispaniola. Here his best ship was bulged upon a rock, on which they had all perished, had it not been flat on the top, so that the soldiers and the whole crew of seamen were saved by the 2 vessels. The inhabitants, stark naked, seeing these strangers, fled to the woods, but the Spaniards overtaking a woman, they entertained her with sweetmeats and Spanish wine, and putting her on a white shirt, sent her again to the rest of the natives. When returned, she told what good entertainment she had had to her companions, whereupon divers of the islanders came aboard of the Spaniards in boats made of 1 piece of wood, where they bartered gold for beads, pieces of glass, knives, shells, and other trifles. The king of Guacanarillo gave testimony of peculiar inclination to the Spaniards, helping them to fish up the remaining goods of the wreck, and informed them that some rivers flowing from the tops of high mountains washed down the gold amongst the sand. Notwithstanding, a strange prophecy had been told to these islanders, namely that bearded men out of remote countries should destroy their goods, take their land, and massacre their children. He also told them what made them fly and betake them to their heels at the arrival of the Spaniards, because they were oftentimes surprised by the cannibals, who snatched up all they could lay hold on, their boys and striplings, the young and well-grown men chopped to pieces, salted and barrelled up. Young women they preserved for breeding, and old ones they made slaves. These cannibals were so terrible to the inhabitants of Hayti that 1,000 of them dared not venture to engage against 10, but would run every way, dispersed like flocks of sheep before the wolf. Lastly, their king permitted the Spaniards to build a lodge or hovel wherein 30 or 40 of them might shelter, but indeed so taking possession in right of the King of Spain. Meanwhile, Columbus returned safely to Spain and was received with great joy. King Ferdinand made him admiral of the sea and sent his brother Bartholomew governor to Hayti, now called Hispaniola, the gold parrots, mastic, aloes, the strange bred yucca, whose extracted juice is rank poison. But the body makes a good meal, which kneaded and baked yields a fine manchet and wholesome food. They looked upon with great delight and admiration. But 2 of the natives being naked, with gold rings through their noses and ears, ornaments with them of high esteem and signifying their no mean quality, the people old and young came in throngs to wonder at, never weary of gazing upon them. But the king, encouraged by this success, took no dilatory course, but suddenly, and before any could expect, built 14 stout caravels and 3 frigates, and as soon manned them with 1,200 soldiers, besides a great number of artificers of all sorts, with their wives and children, freighting them with horses, swine, goats, cattle for breed, all sorts of European corn to sow, fruit trees and vines to plant, and some priests to instruct and convert the natives to their religion. On the 2nd of September, in the year 1493, they set sail from Cadiz and anchored before Ferreo, the last and furthest of the Canary Islands, where they could get no water but what dropped from the dew hanging on trees into troughs. After that, Columbus came on the 21st day amongst the Caribbean islands, where he dropped anchor before one which he called Dominico, but finding it desolate, set sail further and discovered several other coasts, where he likewise found nothing but very great porcupines or hedgehogs and sweet-smelling trees. Steering forward, he found the coasts of the cannibals, which inhabited along the shore in little huts or hovels, built round of wood and staked about on the outside with long poles. Like palisades, they have also posts within which are shorter, pleated, and fastened together with cotton or long roots of trees, pliant like our osiers, over which they hang cloths painted with horrible figures and strange representations. The roofs rise like our canopy tents, highest in the middle, covered with palm tree leaves to keep off the rain. At the entrances hang 2 hairy images on poles, not for religion's sake, but ornament. Bedsteads are high from the ground, are filled with a kind of straw, and in long hovels fitted for that purpose they store their sugar. Columbus, landing here, found all the cannibals fled, but their houses were full of stone vessels, cruses, pans, and pots boiling with men's flesh, parrots, and wildfowl, the haunches and sides of young men, on spits roasting at the fire with the splinters of whose broken bones they headed there. This island, called Caracara by the inhabitants, Columbus changed to Guadalupe because the mountains rise up with their tops, not unlike Estremadura in Spain, famous there for the wonderful representation of Our Lady as that of the Lady of Giurato in Italy. 30 women which he had taken from the neighbouring isles he sent with presents to the fled cannibals, which the next day returning made a great appearance near the shore. But when they had gazed a while upon the Spaniards, looking steadfastly on one another, they suddenly ran back again, sheltering themselves in the covert of the woods. Columbus, thinking it not worth his while to expect their return, seeing their barbarous life, burnt and destroyed all their boats, and spoiling whatever he could, sailed to Matanina. The released women in Guadalupe that came back again informed the Spaniards that Matanina was an isle only inhabited by women, which at accustomed times rowed over to these cannibals, where a while they drove a trade and commerce of love, the product of which, if girls, they kept, but the boys they sent over to their fathers. They live in caves, the mouths and entrances of which they maintain and stoutly make good with their bows, shooting arrows as thick as hail at the approach of men after their impregnating by the cannibals. From there the fleet passed by several other fruitful islands, Columbus giving them the names of Montserrat, Redondo, St. Martin, Santa Cruz, formerly called Ayaya by the inhabitants. On this last island he landed 30 men who took 4 women, which held out their hands before them as if petitioners that begged quarter or praying, and then concealed themselves in ambush, the better to surprise more. When by chance they spied an Indian canoe at sea with 8 men and as many women, whereupon those in ambush made a signal to the next ship, which immediately sent off some boats well manned, but before they drew near them or expected an onset, one of the Spaniards was killed and another wounded. With their arrows, amongst whom a woman to whom all the rest showed the greatest respect and reverence, aimed very exactly. Their barbed shafts were poisoned, whereupon the Spaniards, enraged, stemmed the canoe and overset rowed quite over, which little or nothing availed, for they all swam, and, though separated, shot their arrows at them as if the boat had been a butt. At last, the Indians got upon a blind rock covered with shallow water, which gave them fresh courage. But the Spaniards, having more aid sent them from the fleet, took them all prisoners. But the Queen's son, being wounded in the scuffle and dying soon after, was thrown overboard. The prisoner, being brought before Columbus, foamed at the mouth for raging madness, and being afterwards carried to Castile, so retained their fierce and savage nature that they scared away and frightened the safe beholders. Meanwhile, the Spanish fleet proceeded on their voyage between several islands to Hispaniola, of which some appeared desolate and barren, others green and woody, the small vessels sailing close under the shore, and the great ones standing further off at sea, which was very turbulent and beat exceedingly against the shoal rocks. The island Buriquima Columbus called St. John's, to which belonged some of the women sent forth in Guadalupe, who informed them that Buriquima was well inhabited by a kind and hospitable people. When the cannibals landed there, they fought them, and if conquerors, they were so much exasperated with their inhumane barbarisms that they seized them like mastiffs open-mouthed and tore them piecemeal with their teeth, yet abhorring the custom of eating men's flesh. Here the Spaniards found only a large house surrounded by 12 lesser ones, all deserted, for the inhabitants with their king Chayasiquio had then retired into the cool and more sheltering woods from the midday heat. All this the Indians told him, which he brought back with him from Spain. Coming to an anchor at Hispaniola, he sent one of the Indians ashore so that he might tell what brave things he had seen in the Spanish court. But the remaining 3 took the advantage of the following night, and leaping overboard swam to shore. But this accident he did not much regard, trusting to have a sufficient account from his 38 Spaniards, which he had left in the fort upon the island, and the more because King Guacanarillo's brother, in a sign of friendship, had presented him with 2 golden images. But all these conjectures failed him, so that, hearing nothing, he landed where he found the Spanish garrison utterly destroyed and the royal fort bent down to the ground and lying in a heap of ashes. Then they fired several guns to give notice that if any of them had concealed themselves and lay, skulking in the woods or otherwise, they should discover themselves and come to the succour of their friends. But all in vain, for none came, for as they were afterwards informed, the inhabitants had slain them because of their insupportable behaviour, insolently committing robberies, rapes, and murders. Hereupon he sent messengers to King Guacanarillo to inquire why they had fired his fort and what they had done with his men, who brought him this return, that over that mighty island were many princes, of which 2, being provoked by the reports of the strangers that were entertained in the island, came marching upon them, each with their armies. But he endeavoured what he could and came with a power to assist the strangers. Yet all he got for his kindness was a wound in his leg, which had been so sore and troublesome that it forced him to keep his bed and no less than 7 concubines to attend him and dress the wound. But he told his tale so ill and feigned his lameness worse that Sibelius, one of the messengers sent by Columbus, lifting up the coverlet, saw that he ailed nothing, which soon confirmed his doubt that he was confederated with the rest and alike guilty of the slaughter. At last, Guacanarillo, being desired, came in person to Columbus, in whose presence he held a long discourse with an Indian woman, which they had brought from the island of Santa Cruz, there christened by the name of Catherine. At length Guacanarillo was dismissed, and the night following, this Catherine, with Severin, more of the Indian women, leapt overboard and swam almost a league to shore, going thence directly to their king Guacanarillo. This accident gave more suspicion to Columbus, who thereupon sent 300 men, commanded by Melchior, Hoida, and Gorvalano, to march through the island 3 several ways, and with a special commission to secure Guacanarillo as their prisoner. Melchior discovered a wide river, full of reaches and winding bays, gliding between high hills covered with woods, resounding with the echoing noises of harmonious birds and disgorging its waters, enlarged by 2 other rivers, into the sea, thus creating a convenient harbour for ships. 100 of the islanders, well armed in their own way, met them, crying aloud,
"We are no cannibals, but Tainos, that is, a people more civil than they are cruel."
The Spaniards made signs of peace, and the Tainos approached, joining their forces in a friendly manner. Near the place of this meeting appeared a house built in an oval fashion, with a circumference of 32 paces, and a roof intricately woven with rushes of various colours. Around it stood 30 smaller dwellings. Meanwhile, during his march, Hoida discovered a river that descended from a high mountain where the inhabitants gathered gold in the following manner. They dug a hole about 2 feet deep, then using their right hand, they sifted out the precious ingot. From the sand, which they collected and distributed to the Spaniards without much regard, most of the pieces were the size of peas, but some were so large that they weighed 9 ounces. Peter Martyr, counsellor to Emperor Charles, tells us that he has seen such pieces in the Spanish court that were brought over by Columbus. Furthermore, Hoida was informed here that this gold river originated in the province belonging to Cassicus Caunaboa, which means the king of the Golden Palace. In the meantime, Columbus selected a piece of land on a rising hill in the northern part of the island, where he intended to build a city. The hill was close to a mountain filled with stone and chalk on one side, and on the other side there was a plain that was incredibly fertile and pleasant. The soil was so delightful and productive that the sun hardly shines upon a more fertile and delightful land, as they later discovered through experience. Here, melons ripen in 36 days, corn in 2 months, and the trees and plants produce their various products twice a year. The vines mature and bear clusters of grapes in 2 years, and sugar canes grow as thick as a man's arm in 15 days. On this pleasant land, with a convenient harbour, Columbus later built the city of Isabella, fortified with walls and trenches to defend against invasion. He appointed his brother, Bartholomew Columbus, as the first governor. Meanwhile, Admiral Columbus himself marched into the countryside with 300 men in search of gold mines. The valley of Cibaba is located 72 leagues away from Isabella, and Columbus crossed swift currents and high mountains to reach it. There he built a fort called St. Thomas and traded toys and trinkets with the inhabitants in exchange for pieces and ingots of gold, which the inhabitants found in the sand of their rivers, as mentioned earlier. They also informed him that greater quantities of gold could be found about half a day's journey further in soil of a browner color. As a result, Laxanus, one of his officers, was sent with a sufficient party to explore that area. They traveled through a delightful path, shaded by leafy branches, and pleasant with the sight of spacious meadows where they could graze their horses. After 4 days, the grass grew back higher than our tallest wheat. Meanwhile, Columbus returned with great riches to his new city of Isabella. Shortly thereafter, he set sail with 3 vessels to discover more distant lands, and his expedition was successful. He first arrived in Jamaica, where he encountered stronger opposition from the native people upon landing. However, when they realized they were outnumbered, they agreed to a peaceful resolution, and from there, setting sail, he next discovered Cuba, which he found to be an island as he sailed around it. Upon landing in a convenient harbor, with each side protected by high jutting rocks, he spotted 2 small huts where there was an abundance of fish. 2 large snakes, each with 8 feet, skewered and ready to be roasted over a fire. However, there were no men, women, or children to be seen, as they had gone into the nearby woods with some of the fish they had cooked. The Spaniards followed them and saw numerous snakes hanging by small strings from tree branches. Some of the snakes had their mouths tied shut, while others had their tongues and teeth pulled out. Continuing their march, they soon came across a group of natives, estimated to be about 70 men, gathered at the top of a hill. The Spaniards made gestures and displayed their colorful trinkets to attract them closer, but it was in vain. Finally, one of the natives descended from the hill, and one of the previously captured natives, taken from the island Guanahani near Cuba during Columbus's first voyage, brought to Spain, and baptized there, called out to him, assuring them that they had nothing to fear, and that no harm would be done to them. Hearing this, all the natives came down, and informed them that they were sent by their king to catch fish for another king who was dining with him. They expressed gratitude for not eating the snakes, as they were reserved for the second course and considered a delicacy greater than any fish. Columbus, from there, continued westward and discovered a fruitful coastline near the mouth of a river, where the water flowed boiling hot into the sea. Further on, he encountered very strange fish, especially the guaycan, which resembled an eel but had an extraordinarily large head with a bag-like skin hanging over it. The natives used this fish for fishing. They attached a line or cord to it, and when a turtle or any other prey emerged from the water, they let out the line. The guaycan, acting like an arrow, would swiftly out of a bow shoot towards the other fish, and then gathers the mouth of the bag on his head like a purse net, holding them so fast that he doesn't let go until they are hauled out of the water. Here, after the Spaniards had dined on delicious fish, they continued westward and reached an uninhabited island, but it was well stocked with geese, pelicans, and strange dogs that could not bark. They encountered so many shoals that the keels of their ships scraped the ground for almost 40 leagues, with the water turning thick and white like milk. Eventually, they reached deep water again and landed at the base of a high mountain on the island of Cuba, where they discovered 2 springs of very sweet water. While the rest of the crew filled their vessels with water and cut wood, Musketeer ventured into the woods and spotted a tall man wearing a coat similar to a white friar's frock. 2 others followed behind him, and soon after, 30 more men dressed in the same manner appeared. The musketeer fled, but they gestured for him to stay, yet he marched off. He informed Columbus of his encounter, and Columbus sent a well-armed party to explore further into the country. However, they neither saw nor heard any men. They only found a vast plain on the other side of the woods, but it was overgrown with deep grass, making it impossible to pass through. The following day, 25 more men were sent out, but they found nothing except the footprints of large beasts and lions, as well as an abundance of large grapes hanging from the branches of vines entwined around the trunks of tall trees. Subsequently, Columbus set sail again, heading west, and discovered a shore flooded with water and abundant in pearl mussels. He then encountered a country full of mountains with smoking peaks. By this time, the fleet had suffered considerable damage from the shallow waters where they frequently struck and scraped their keels on the ground. They had sprung several leaks, and their provisions had become moldy due to the dampness. As a result, they were forced to turn back. When they changed direction, they collided with turtles that were so numerous in the sea that it seemed as if they had been sown. Upon his return to Cuba, Columbus encountered an elderly man who was completely naked. The man spoke to him, interpreted by Didacus, in a language that partially resembled that of Hispaniola, saying,
"You have come to see this country from another world in a truly astonishing manner. My advice to you is to harm none, for the souls of evildoers go to dark places. On the contrary, those who are friends to peace shall enjoy the highest pleasures."
Columbus replied that he came as a scourge to the cruel cannibals, but as a shield to protect the peaceful and well-meaning Indians. Afterwards, upon returning to Hispaniola, much to his dismay, Columbus found that everything he had established there had been turned upside down. The governors in Isabella were quarreling and engaged in private conflicts among themselves. The Benedictine monk Boylus and Peter Margaretes had returned to Spain to present their complaints at court. Furthermore, the Spaniards had acted inhumanely toward the natives, committing frequent acts of rape, theft, and murder. As a result, the Indians, justifiably angered, destroyed all the Spaniards they found straggling outside the fortifications. Carnaboa also besieged Fort St. Thomas and laid siege to Hoeda, but upon receiving news of Columbus's arrival, he lifted the siege and retreated. However, he was soon captured by the Spaniards. Meanwhile, due to a foolish plot, the natives of Hispaniola had not tilled the soil, sowed any crops, or engaged in agriculture. Previous year, as they were plotting something by want of provisions, not considering themselves, to starve out the Spaniards, but the mischief fell upon the contrivers. Such a great famine occurred that spread across the entire country, and within a few months 50,000 people starved to death. The Spaniards managed to survive with their own limited supplies. Then, although it was too late, the islanders regretted their foolishness as they saw the Spaniards taking advantage of their misery. The Spaniards not only built more houses in their city of Isabella, but also prepared their weather-beaten vessels. They sailed to the gold mountains of Cipangi on the hill where several fountains sprang up, and they erected the Castle of the Conception. They gained great benefits from this fort, where they brought daily abundance of amber, brimstone, mixed silver and gold ore, Brazil wood, and a large amount of gold. They could have obtained 10 times more if they had not been so inclined towards laziness and indulging in other vain pleasures. Nevertheless, the fleet transported over 1,200 pounds of gold to Spain that year. Meanwhile, the natives complained to Columbus about the Spanish soldiers who, under the pretext of searching for gold, committed many intolerable outrages. They requested that the soldiers be confined to their forts and not allowed to wander so freely. In return, they promised to bring a certain weight of cotton, amber, Brazil, wood, and gold every 3 months, exceeding what the soldiers took unlawfully. However, Columbus, despite his severity and enforcement of martial law on some of his soldiers for their crimes, ultimately prevailed in allowing them to continue their actions. But the inhabitants never fulfilled their promise because they were almost starving and struggled to keep themselves alive, spending their time foraging for food. While the situation remained in this state of turmoil, or rather confusion, Sibanus, the brother of the imprisoned Carnaboa, raised an army of 5,000 men. The Spaniards, divided into 5 companies, marched to meet them. Their enemies, who were naked and armed only with bows, arrows, and clubs, put up some resistance, but were quickly dispersed and fled. Many were captured by the Spanish cavalry, while others were forced to hide and seek refuge in the mountains. Shortly after this battle, a hurricane accompanied by thunderclaps occurred. It tore large pieces from the rocks, and the eastward blowing wind caused houses and trees to be destroyed. Some trees were carried high into the air. 3 ships that were anchored in the harbor broke their new cable and smashed against the rocks. The Spaniards believed that the end of the world was approaching due to this severe storm, while the islanders attributed the raging of the heavens to the wickedness of the Spaniards. Once the storm subsided and the air calmed, Columbus ordered the construction of 2 new ships. In March of 1495, he returned to Spain with these ships. He provided an account of the discovered countries at the court in Medina del Campo. Several Spaniards, including the Benedictine monk Boylus, were sentenced primarily for their mistreatment of Columbus. Boylus, out of pure malice, intentionally bypassed Columbus during Mass while distributing the host to others without any justification. Columbus also reported that his brother Bartholomew had found several deep pits 60 leagues beyond Isabella, from which sifting the uppermost ground yielded an abundance of gold. Furthermore, Bartholomew had constructed the castle Oria there within 3 months with little difficulty. However, provisions were scarce in the region, so he found himself necessitated to remove but left 10 men in the garrison and had sent 300 of the islanders with their governors to Spain. He also built the castle Dominico on the south side of Hispaniola. From there, he travelled into the country to the river Naiba, where King Buteo Anacorchoa had encamped himself against the Naibans in an attempt to bring them, along with several other people, under his subjection. Bartholomew demanded tribute from Anacorchoa, who immediately promised to pay and disbanded his forces. He then accompanied Bartholomew for over 30 leagues along a path lined with hemp and cotton trees to his palace Exaragua in the west of Hispanis Exaragua in the west of Hispaniola, where he received a grand reception. 30 of the king's wives walked ahead, carrying palm tree branches in their hands and singing and dancing in a peculiar manner. They were followed by a significant number of beautiful naked virgins. Finally, Bartholomew entered the palace with the king and found a table set with a variety of delicacies and received a very courteous hospitality. The next day, while walking out to a large plain, he witnessed 2 parties, engaged in a fierce battle behind a hill, resulting in great casualties on both sides. Had he not requested them to cease fighting, there would have been even more bloodshed. After several days of friendly entertainment, he returned to the forts of Isabella, Sperancia, Catharina, St. Jago, Torreta, Conception, and Dominico, where he found over 300 starving Spaniards, in addition to many who were sick. At that time, Garionexius, who had been oppressed by the Spaniards and had been waiting for an opportunity, raised an army of 15,000 men. He intended to test his luck against Columbus. However, Columbus received secret intelligence about this and suddenly and unexpectedly attacked Garionexius, spoiling his plans and capturing all his commanders. However, to appease the inhabitants who pleaded for their king, Columbus set him free and advised him to be cautious in starting a war against him any more. But he not being able to endure the oppressions of Roldanus Eximenes, a Spanish commander, fled to the wild Siquanos, descended from the cannibals, and living on steep mountains. Of these he desired aid against the Spaniards, and obtained not only their promise, but some men, with which he robbed and pillaged the country round about, and what Spaniards he met with killed, and with his men did eat, as if a venison feast. Meanwhile Eximenes made himself leader of 70 rebels, which like raging bloodhounds fell upon the natives after a terrible manner. Whilst all things were thus in disorder at Hispaniola, the Admiral Christopher Columbus set sail a 3rd time with 8 ships from the haven Barrameda in the year 1498 to shun the French pirates, which watched for the Indian treasures. He directed his course to Madeira, a fruitful island of corn, wine, sugar, wax, and cattle, desolate till anno 1420. Here, coming to an anchor, he sent 6 ships away to Hispaniola, which himself afterwards followed with the remaining 2, steering by the Flemish Islands, or Azores, first so called from the Flemings, the first planters. Here he dropped anchor before the city Angra on the Isle Tercera, which is 16 leagues in circumference and very mountainous, the tops whereof are like spires and abound with grapes. The plain country produces great store of corn, but it will not keep above 12 months. The ground is oftentimes terribly shaken by earthquakes, and between several sulphurous places both flames and smoke ascend up to the sky. Near the city Angra is a fountain which turns wood into stone. The winds in this place blow so fierce and strong that they not only beat down houses, but wear out iron and all manner of stonework. In Angra, the chief commander of all the Flemish Isles has his residence. The city, surrounded by steep rocks, lies towards the sea like a crescent or half-moon, for at both ends thereof the mountains extend with deep points into the ocean. The uppermost part towards the west stands likewise, fortified by a high rock, as also by another on the east. On both are continual watches kept, whereof those on the first can discover ships 15 leagues off at sea, coming either from the East or West Indies, and on the other from the East or West Indies, and on the other all those that come from Europe. When they see above 15 sail, they put out the king's great flag upon the top of all the rock. This city of Angra is divided into several streets. The governor and archbishop live each in a stately palace. 5 handsome churches are no small ornament to it. The sea before it abounds with fish, but are not to be taken in December by reason of the turbulent waves. Christopher Columbus, having refreshed at Angra, sailed along the African coast between the Hesperides. Under the equinoctial, he was so miserably tormented by the heat that his vessels seemed to burn. The hoops sprung from the casks so that the water ran about the hold, and they could expect nothing but death from the insufferable heat and want of water. 8 days they had endured this hardship when they met with a fresh gale out of the southeast, so that they made great way towards the west. On the last of July he discovered 3 high mountains, and approaching near the shore, he smelt as in a posy all the sweet breathings of fragrant flowers commixed, and at last saw a convenient haven, where going ashore he found cultivated grounds and steps of beasts, but not a man appeared. Next day they spied a boat with 20 young men come rowing from the shore into the ocean. The admiral hailed them in vain to come aboard, for they made the greater haste ashore. Still looking around with great admiration at the ships, Columbus commanded his men to beat their drums and sound their trumpets, hoping to entice the natives to come aboard. However, the natives interpreted it as a sign of war and prepared themselves for resistance. Meanwhile, the Spaniards caught up with an Indian boat and threw in a hat and other small items. The astonished islanders signaled for them to row ashore, but soon after they fled. Continuing his journey, Columbus arrived at Paria, where he discovered a fisherman's boat loaded with oysters. Upon opening the oysters and removing the oysters and removing the meat, they found numerous pearls. However, these pearls were not highly regarded due to their abundance. Strings of pearls in exchange for a broken dish and a rusty knife. Afterward, while anchored in the river of Cumana, several naked men adorned with golden armlets and pearl strings came aboard. They informed Columbus that they obtained gold from the mountains and rivers and harvested pearl oysters in the nearby seas. Some of the Spaniards received a gracious reception from the king and his son. They were led into a palace where they were seated on finely crafted ebony benches. Suddenly, several servants appeared, serving a variety of delicious dishes and well-tasted wine. However, due to scarce provisions among the seamen and spoiled meat, Columbus decided to postpone further pearls, trading for a better opportunity. As they continued their journey, the sea became increasingly shallow to the point where Columbus's ship barely had enough water to stay afloat. This inconvenience was followed by another. The sea was filled by another. The sea was filled with weeds and grass, making navigation difficult. A river 30 yards deep and 20 leagues wide rushed out between 2 shores into the sea with such force that the waves rose like mountains. Columbus perceived great danger and changed his course, finally anchoring before Hispaniola on the 28th of August 1490. He found the situation there to still be in a state of sad confusion, as previously described. Roldanus Aximenes refused to follow Christopher Columbus's orders and instead wrote letters to the King of Spain in which he heavily criticized both Columbus and his brother. However, Columbus and his brother wrote letters presenting a completely contrary account detailing the heinous crime committed by Aximenes. They requested assistance to ensure that such a great offender would receive appropriate punishment. Meanwhile, the Sequano natives marched down with 6,000 men, and Bartholomew went to meet them with 80-foot soldiers and a few horses. The natives appeared more like furies than men, as they were covered in black smudges from head to foot and had their coarse hair braided in a terrifying manner, hanging and swaying over their shoulders. As the Spaniards approached a river, finding the best spot to ford, they had barely left the bank and started wading through the water when the natives emerged from the woods and unleashed a shower of arrows. If it weren't for the shields and targets the Spaniards carried, providing defense against the dense and accurately aimed arrows, many would have perished. After reaching the opposite bank, the enemy swiftly disappeared, seeking refuge in the protection of the woods. The conquering party pursued them, but encountered great difficulty and danger due to their weapons especially. Their shields getting entangled among the dense vegetation like a net and intertwining branches, which they passed, they maneuvered and advanced like hunting spaniels following their prey, continuously harassing them with their arrows. As a result, they abandoned their futile pursuit and changed their direction, marching in order to intercept Maobarnexius and his 8,000 Sequano warriors who were descending upon them. This turned out to be a more challenging task than anticipated, as it took Columbus 3 months to defeat him and his determined group. And this concludes this chapter of America's Chapter 3. Stay tuned for Chapter 4. And this is Lend Me Your Ear.